lady died on March 3rd. Everyone in the neighborhood said she was a witch, but I found it rude that they would say so. However, it wasn't until after her death that I would come to confirm that perhaps the people in the neighborhood were right. Good evening, community. I hope you listen to the following stories in the best of spirits. And if not, if something is weighing on you, we hope these tales offer you an escape. That even if just for a little while, you can forget about everything else. That is the mission of this podcast. Today's stories are the kind that could have happened to anyone. Stories that a friend, a family member, or a coworker could have told you. But their simplicity doesn't make them any less terrifying, and they are the kind of accounts that will stay with you for a long time. So let's get into tonight's stories. Listen to them as entertainment, or as a warning. You'll know which one to choose. You're listening to Tales of the Night. I'm writing to you from El Salvador, from a small town where, as you can imagine, rumors travel faster than fast. That's why I'd like my story to remain anonymous, please. For some time I had been curious about sharing some of the many strange experiences I've had, but the one that happened recently is what finally gave me the courage to write to you. To give a little context, this happened not long ago, but it begins many years back. Near my home lived an elderly woman, and the neighborhood always said she was a witch. When I was little, I never believed it. In fact, she always gave me the impression of being a calm, gentle grandmother. I imagined she would be the kind who offers you hot chocolate when you visit her, which is why I even felt a little bothered hearing people talk about her that way, talking without really knowing her. But something happened one December when I was on vacation that made me start to have doubts. That day I went out with my cousin to ride bikes around the neighborhood, and when we passed in front of her house, we saw her come out to the yard holding a container. From where we were, we watched her tilt it and pour something onto the ground. At first we didn't know what it was, but since we were curious, we moved a little closer. When we got a good look at what she had dumped, our stomachs turned. They were like remains of small animals, dark and wet, blood, skin, and bones. Something quite revolting. I have a tremendous phobia of toads and things like that, so I took off running immediately. My cousin stayed a few more seconds staring, and then ran after me, pale, trying not to vomit. From that day forward, I swear, every time we passed in front of her house, we felt something off even in the air, as if the smell of blood from that day had lingered there. So we preferred to avoid that side of the street. With time, everything was gradually forgotten, little by little, the way everything is, until a few days ago. On March 13th, the woman passed away. Since her house was very small, her family decided to hold the wake outside. They used a lane of the street to set up chairs so that the neighbors could come pay their respects. The problem was that my sister had left her car parked nearby. Some of the woman's relatives came to knock on our door and ask that we move it, but my sister wasn't home and hadn't left the keys, and the conversation ended in a minor argument. My mom got quite upset. I remember she said something that left me thinking long afterward. She said that even in death, that woman wouldn't stop being a nuisance. I told her she'd better not say that, because around here you always hear stories, and they say you don't mess with witches, that you don't speak ill of witches, not even when they're already dead, because they can still hear you. But my mom just said she was joking, and I didn't think much of it. Barely moments later, not even 5 minutes, the lights in the house went out all at once. It wasn't like a normal power outage. Everything simply went dark from 1 second to the next. The television turned off, the fan stopped humming, and the house fell into a deep silence. You couldn't even hear the sounds from the street. My mom called out from the kitchen saying the power had probably gone out, but something didn't add up for me. I looked at my phone and it was still charging. The screen was on and the battery icon showed it was still gaining charge. I went to the window to look outside. The neighbors' houses were completely lit up, the street lamps were still on, and you could even hear the television from the house next door. Only our house was in darkness, and it felt unusually quiet. I decided to go check the main breaker. The hallway connecting to the living room has always been a little dark, but that night it felt longer than usual. The only light coming in was from the street, through a crack in the window. As I walked, I noticed I still couldn't hear the street. No noise, no wind, only my own footsteps. The air felt colder, and there was that uncomfortable feeling of not being alone. When I was nearing the far end of the hallway, I noticed something strange. Something in the darkness of the living room looked different, as if, in the middle of the shadows, something was standing there. But it reflected no light at all. It was like a black shadow within the darkness. I stood staring for a few seconds, trying to let my eyes adjust, trying to make out any shape, any form. At first, I thought it might be a piece of furniture or maybe the door left ajar, but then I made out a silhouette. It had no clear shape. It was more like a patch of darkness with volume, as if a shadow had detached itself from the wall. My first thought was that someone had broken into the house. I asked in a sharp tone who was there, but no one answered. Then something happened that frightened me even more. The shadow tilted slightly to one side, but not with a sudden movement. It was exactly the kind of gesture someone makes when they're trying to get a better look at something in the dark. In that moment, I felt the fear run through me from the back of my neck, trailing down my spine. I took a step back. The shadow moved too, but it didn't walk. It sort of glided forward slightly. That's when real fear set in, because I got the distinct impression that whatever that thing was, it understood perfectly that I was looking at it. I stepped back again and heard a faint sound, like something touching the floor. When I looked again, I could have sworn the silhouette was a little closer. I didn't think twice. I ran to my bedroom, and the lights came back on. Everything switched on at once. The fan started spinning again, the television came back to life. After a few minutes, I gathered the courage to go back out. The hallway was lit and there was nothing unusual, but when I reached the far end of the living room, I saw something on the floor. It was a small pile of dark soil. Very dark, still damp, as if it had been dug up from the ground not long before. I stood there staring at it for a moment, because I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Moments earlier, when the house still had power, that soil had not been there. Hello to all the community. The truth is, I'm not really a fan of horror stories. In fact, the only reason I'm writing this is because my girlfriend listens to your show all the time and insisted, really insisted, that I share something that happened to me a couple of years ago when I was working at a Soriana here in Saltillo. I was on the night shift. We would come in when the store was already closing and leave just before dawn. Our job was to stock merchandise, replenish the warehouse, and have the aisles ready for when the store opened in the morning. At that hour, the store feels very different. Nothing like what you see during the day, when there's noise, music, and people talking. In the early morning hours, it becomes an enormous silent place. All you can hear are the forklifts, the wheels of the pallets, and the footsteps of those of us working. There were only a few of us on at night, a handful from the warehouse, 2 or 3 on the floor, and the security guard, an older gentleman. I don't remember his exact age, but he had already been working there for many years. From the moment I started, he used to say something I always took as a half-joke. He said there were 4 different ghosts in the store. Sometimes he said it seriously, sometimes laughing, but he always ended the same way, that one day he'd show them to me. I never paid much attention to it. But it didn't take long before I started noticing something strange. There were certain aisles my co-workers avoided during the early morning hours. Nobody wanted to go stock things in those sections whenever the guard sent a warning in the group chat, because the guard had access to the security cameras, and he would occasionally send messages to the night shift chat saying things like, "Aisle 4 at the back." Once I asked one of the more senior co-workers about it, and he told me something that stuck with me. Just listen to the old man. If he says don't go down an aisle, don't go. Several months went by, and I never saw anything unusual. Until one early morning. It had been a grueling shift, and I was exhausted. There wasn't much time left before we clocked out, and I just wanted to finish stocking a few things in the warehouse and wait for the hour. Then I got a message on my phone. Just for me. It was from the guard, asking if I could come quickly to the security booth. I figured maybe he needed help with something, or they wanted to check an area, so I made my way to the office where the camera monitors were. When I arrived, he signaled for me to come closer. "Come here," he said. "Look." He pointed to one of the monitors. It was a camera aimed at one of the store's aisles. I swear to you, there was a woman standing right in the middle of the aisle, dressed in white, with long dark hair, looking lost. The image was clear. It wasn't a shadow or something blurry. It was a person, pixelated but a person. My first instinct was to pull out my phone and record the screen, but the guard placed his hand on my arm. "Don't record," he said firmly. He explained that if I posted anything and it got out, he'd be in serious trouble. So I put my phone away. The two of us stood there watching the monitor. The woman wasn't doing anything. She was just standing there. A few seconds passed. We were silent. Then all of a sudden she raised her head. From that distance I couldn't be sure, but it looked as though she turned her gaze toward the camera. I don't know why, but in that moment I felt something strange, like when someone stares at you intently, even from far away. After that, she turned around and started walking toward the back of the aisle. We followed her with our eyes on the monitor. She walked a few meters and then simply disappeared, as if she had stepped into the wall. The guard jumped to his feet immediately. "Let's go," he said, and we headed toward that aisle almost at a run. The store was completely sealed. All doors locked as always during the early morning hours. When we reached the spot where we had seen her vanish, we checked everything. The wall, the shelves, the back. There was no door, no gap, no way anyone could have slipped out. And there was no one else in that aisle. We stood there in silence for a moment. The guard just shook his head, as if he already knew how it would turn out. Then he said something very calmly. "That's one of the 4. You'll get to see at least one more." Thankfully, in the 2 months I stayed there, I never saw another one. Not even her again. But of course, from that night on, I always avoided the aisles the guard warned us about too. Hello community. I'm Kike Islas, a regular listener of the channel, and I wanted to share something that happened to me when I returned to my grandparents' village, San Miguel Tlaixpan, in Texcoco. There is a spring there that everyone knows as La Barranca del Silencio, the Ravine of Silence. From the time I was a child, I heard stories about the Ahuaques, beings who, according to the Nahuatl tradition of the region, watch over the water. My grandmother always said something when we went there, that the water had to be deeply respected. But she didn't mean it in the way you'd caution someone about swimming carefully or using water wisely. No. There was something much deeper in those words. The first time she took me, I must have been around 11 years old. I remember she placed a candle and some yellow flowers on a stone, like an offering to something. At the time, I figured it was just a way to make children take the spring more seriously, to teach us to care for our natural resources. Over the years, I moved to the city, and about 20 years passed before I returned to the village to sell my grandparents' house. It was June, already the rainy season. Everything smelled of wet earth and freshly tapped pulque, a scent I hadn't realized I missed so much. I loved walking through those lands. One afternoon, some neighbors told me not to go down into the ravine alone after dark, that the spring was sensitive. I didn't pay much attention, since I didn't even understand what they meant, but that same night I heard something strange near the water, a very odd sound. It wasn't a frog or a bird. It was a small, regular tapping, like someone clinking tiny metal spoons beneath the surface of the water. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's the only way I can describe it. The following day, I went to the spring with a water jug to bring some back to the house. The path was covered in wet leaves. As I was making my way down around a bend, I noticed something that caught my attention. There were small toy dishes arranged in a semicircle on a rock, as if someone had set up a tiny table. There was also a wrapped candy and a freshly cut flower. I assumed some child from the village had been playing there, though that seemed unlikely, since the spot was quite far from everything, and I moved the items aside to get by. I filled the jug without putting my hands in the water, more out of habit than anything else, and headed back. That night, I had a very strange dream. I dreamed I was walking down a very narrow cobblestone street. There were small houses on either side, with clay doors. From the windows, small shadows watched me. They had no eyes, and at the far end, someone called me by name. It was a child's voice, calling me over and over with great urgency, and no matter how much the dream shifted, I always returned to that place. The voice wouldn't leave my head. I woke up with a fever. For the next 2 days, I had a pounding headache and chest pain. My aunt said I had caught a draft, but a neighbor who had seen me go down to the spring alone was far more direct. She told me, "They saw you, and you didn't ask permission. This won't go away on its own." She took me to see a man in the village who knows how to perform cleansings, Don Mateo. He passed a bundle of spearmint and rue over my body, and then placed it in a bowl filled with water from the spring itself. That was essential, he said. At that moment, the water turned murky. Don Mateo stared at it for a long moment. Then he said something I still don't fully understand, but that made me uneasy. It wasn't just one. There were several. That same afternoon, we went down to the ravine with an offering. We brought candles, sweet bread, flowers, and a small clay jug of pulque. We also brought back the toy dishes I had moved aside without thinking when I went for water. Don Mateo spoke in a low voice, in Nahuatl, asking forgiveness for my carelessness. As he spoke, the wind began to stir through the trees. I swear to you, it blew differently. I swear that for a moment, the spring stopped bubbling and went completely still. I thought that would be the end of it, but that night something else happened. I was lying down when I heard a whistle in the yard. 3 times, short. I went outside with a flashlight. On the ground there were small footprints, like those of a barefoot child. They came from the well in the yard and led toward the ravine. I felt no fear, just a strange sensation, almost like an urgency to follow them. I took the flashlight and made my way down. The spring was fuller than usual because of the rains. I'll warn you that the rest of my story becomes even harder to believe. When I shone the light toward the rocks, I saw several small figures sitting on the bank, the size of a small child. I couldn't make out their faces clearly. They were like wet shadows. One of them raised something shiny. It was a ring. Instinctively, I touched my finger and mine was gone. I don't know if I lost it when I went for water. I didn't remember noticing its absence until that moment. The figure set the ring down on the bank, then took a step back. And then I heard a small voice, very close to the water. The candles we had left that afternoon were still burning. I left the ring where it was, took the candy I had in my pocket, and placed it on the stone. The figures retreated into the darkness, dissolving like smoke in the water. The spring was bubbling again, completely as normal. The following day, finally, the fever was gone. Before leaving the village, I went down to the spring one more time and left some flowers on the stone where the offering had been. The water was completely clear, and the small toy dishes were arranged exactly as I had first seen them, as if someone had set them back in place. My name is Andrea, and I'm a huge fan of the show. To be honest, I never thought I would one day write in with my own story, In my house, it's long been said that sometimes the shadow of a man has been seen. A figure that, according to some family members, looks very much like someone from the family. I've always listened to those stories with respect, but I had never experienced them myself, never truly understood they were real, until 2 weeks ago. That day I was home alone, listening once more to one of my favorite episodes, The Crucifix of Father Lucas. Right at the part where they mentioned the prayer the women repeated, I heard something from the kitchen. The sound of a glass shattering, clear and sharp, as if it had been smashed against the floor. I stayed still for a couple of seconds, thinking maybe I had misheard. I went to check, and there was nothing broken. No shards on the floor. Everything was in its place. I want to be clear that I don't think this had anything to do with the podcast or the prayer mentioned in that episode. I had listened to that same episode before, even alone in the middle of the night, and nothing had ever happened. I only mention it because it was the moment when everything started to feel off. That night, I decided to fall asleep listening to another episode, The Curse of La Cerda. I remembered the warning about not listening to stories while trying to sleep, but I did it anyway. I don't know what time it was when something woke me. It was a whisper, a sound right next to my ear. Psst, psst, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I opened my eyes. I was still half asleep when I looked toward the door of my room. There was a figure, a shadow in the shape of a man. It was standing in the doorway. It remained motionless for a few seconds, and I told myself it was probably my imagination, or that I was still dreaming. It was the only explanation I could hold on to. But then it began to approach. Slowly, far too slowly. It moved closer without lifting its feet, without any walking motion, as if it were an object being dragged toward the bed. When it reached the foot of the bed, I felt the mattress sink, as if someone were climbing onto it. I tried to move. I couldn't. I tried to scream. No sound came out. It was as though my body was still asleep. I felt its weight advance slowly across the bed, until it was completely on top of me. Its hands were on my shoulders, cold and wet to the touch. Then they moved up to my face. It opened my mouth and slipped its fingers inside and began pulling at my teeth with force. One by one, I could feel the pressure on each tooth, as if at any moment they would be torn out at the root. The episode was still playing in the background. I could hear it clearly, and every time I tried to resist, I heard that sound again, very close to my face. Then it stopped. It took its hands away. I felt the mattress slowly return to its shape, as if the weight were gradually lifting. The cold began to fade, but not entirely. Until I woke up. I woke up. What I experienced felt overwhelmingly real, but it sounds like a dream. Like sleep paralysis, doesn't it? That's what it sounds like. But I felt it as real. I know it was real. What worries me is that after that night, my room no longer feels the same. Sometimes a smell appears, like cigarette smoke. And it's not just any smell. It's a very strong scent, pungent and old. My mom smokes, yes, but the smell of her cigarettes is nothing like what I smell. This is different, heavier, older, and to this day I don't know where it comes from. If my story gets published, thank you so much for reading it, Uriel, and greetings to the entire community.